Good evening. I'm finding in these days that my heart is more tuned to poetry. So tonight, to open and then later to close, I am reading two blessings from a book called A Cure for Sorrow by Jan Richardson. Blessing in the anger. You might think that it would come with a clamoring, a clashing, clanging armed boots, hollering and lost in hot rage. But what it does not tell you is how quietly it loves to bear itself toward us, hardly uttering a word until it shows up with such suddenness, splintering into the broken pieces on the floor, the dent in the wall, the hole torn in what had once been whole. And no one there to witness the damage, no one to sweep away the shards. Let anger be no stranger. Let it be visitor, teacher, guide. Let it be messenger, come to tell us what we most need to hear, hard though its words may be to hear. Trust, even when you cannot believe it, that it will carry its own consolations, that it knows what to do with what's been shattered. Trust that the other face of anger is courage, that it holds the key to our secret strength, that the fire it offers will light our way.
Good evening. My name is Rabbi Heidi Cohen, and I am the Interim Director of Jewish Life here at Chapman. And it is an honor to welcome all of you to this evening's Kristallnacht event, this Interfaith Service of Remembrance and Hope, a community shattered and a community united. On behalf of the Fish Interfaith Center, I welcome you. And we gather together at this time of terrible conflict, and we gather together as a community of diverse religious traditions, united by our shared hope for peace and shared respect for one another, as it is more important now than ever. As we mark this 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, we acknowledge the brokenness in our world today. We pray for the safe return of the roughly 240 Israeli hostages, and for safety and peace for all those in Gaza and in Israel. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation ever again. May this time come soon. May we continue in strength and to do the sacred work of memory, education, dialogue, and the sacred work toward peace.
Good evening. My name is Vesper Mills. I am representing Jewish Life here at Chapman tonight, and I will be reading two works, the first of which is the testimony of Herbert Lindenmayer. When Hitler first came to power, my father said, "There is still time, after all. This is the country of Goethe and Schiller and Beethoven. And they wouldn't do anything to us. All right, it is tough right now, but how long can it last?" He had to give up his pharmacy. They didn't take it away immediately. He had to employ somebody who would run the pharmacy, and he was only allowed to help out occasionally. The reason they said was he could poison the German people by selling them poison instead of drugs and medicines. In 1938, he was forced to sell the pharmacy. At the time of Kristallnacht, I wasn't home. My father was arrested. My mother asked me to come home immediately, and I did. My father was in Buchenwald until December, about 4 or 5 weeks. Then he was released because he was a war veteran. He had the Iron Cross. He was in sad shape when he came home. I am sure he was beaten. It took him quite a while to recover after he came home. It was wintertime. I remember his feet were frostbitten. Then he was more or less convinced there was no future, and he took steps to emigrate. But by that time, it was too late. I know to get an American visa or American papers in January, there was a waiting list. I still remember our number. It was 44,444, so I can never forget that number. Now, the second reading I will be doing is An Action Against the Jews by Arnold Blum. I stood before the burning shul and watched as the firemen protected the surrounding buildings, being careful not to put any water on the isolated curls of smoke rising here and there from the devastated sanctuary that once was our shul. I stood before the burning shul, unbelievingly, in deep shock, empty of strength, gutted, as was our shul. A murder had been committed, symbolic as it were, soon to be followed by the near annihilation of our people. Slowly, my senses returned in a wave of anger. I clenched my fists, my eyes filled with tears of outrage. My silence screamed, Kuma Adonai ve'afutso oivecha. Rise up, Lord, and scatter your enemies. But the clouds did not part. The shofar did not sound. The strong hand and the outstretched arm did not appear. It was not the year of our Lord. He had averted his face.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. I want to express my gratitude to the staff of the Fish Interfaith Center, to our two talented musicians, and most especially to our 3 student readers, representing Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. At this time, when community and mutual respect mean more than ever, these 3 young people represent the best of our university, and I'd like to ask them to stand. I've struggled with what to say tonight on the 85th anniversary of the pogrom of November 9th through 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht. In past years, and this is the 16th year we have held this event, I have spoken of our responsibility to sustain memory as we transition to a time when there are no survivors of the Holocaust to speak of what they experienced. But tonight is very different from all those past years. All 4 of our dear survivor friends who experienced Kristallnacht and spoke here on the 75th anniversary 10 years ago have now passed. We miss them a great deal, but sorrow is mixed with relief that they did not live to witness the unfathomable horror of October 7th and its aftermath. I have wondered how the events we have seen in the last weeks would impact us this evening as we remember Kristallnacht. We have often spoken of what occurred, but tonight, this year, feels and is different. The events that began a month ago today, the indescribable brutality enacted by Hamas, the rise in anti-Semitism in this country and around the world, have brought us to a place where we can begin to understand, indeed, perhaps for the first time, to feel the terrible shock of Kristallnacht. Like those who lived through it, we know the unimaginable can become reality. Like them, we have witnessed the abyss of evil and inhumanity. Tonight, as we listen to Idele Stapholtz, 12 years old in 1938, speak of hiding in fear as the brown shirts stormed her orphanage, and as we hear Leopold Szneer, his voice still quivering with rage, describe the desecration and destruction of his beloved synagogue, we feel their shock and pain and grief joined to our own. In many ways, the events of Kristallnacht and the events we have experienced over the last month are very different. In the pogrom of November 9th and 10th, some 100 Jews were killed, not 1,400. The 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps could hope for release, especially if they would pledge to leave the country. We don't know the circumstances of the hostages, many of them children and elderly, and whether or not they will survive and be reunited with their families. We can only pray for their release as soon as possible, and we can join together to pray for peace. Following Kristallnacht, there was no dearth of headlines decrying the violence. On November 15th, President Roosevelt said, quote, "The news of the past few days from Germany has deeply shocked public opinion in the United States. I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in a 20th century civilization," unquote. But outrage did not translate into action to change policy. When asked if, in light of recent events in Germany, more Jewish refugees might be allowed into this country, FDR replied, quote, "That is not in contemplation. We have the quota system," unquote. Circumstances now are very different from those of 1938. Yet, like those who experienced Kristallnacht and the much greater horror that would follow, we too must find within ourselves the will and the courage to resist evil and affirm life. We cannot allow ourselves to be overwhelmed, paralyzed, and hopeless. By coming together tonight, we affirm that we will not allow our university community to be divided by hatred and ignorance. We affirm that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have no place on our campus or in our lives. Across the span of 85 years, we are one with those we remember tonight, who experienced evil but refused to allow it to consume their humanity. We will hear that humanity, that strength of spirit, later tonight as we listen to a recording of Cantor Szneer singing the El Malay Rachamim. In closing, I'd like to quote a few sentences from a recent opinion piece by Dara Horn. Referencing the fact that the Hamas attack occurred on Simchat Torah, she wrote, "Right now, many of us feel trapped in this old story, doom scrolling through images with terrible outcomes. But in our grief, I remind myself that each year, as we finish the reading of the Torah, we immediately, at that very moment, and at the moment of this newest, oldest horror, scroll back to the story of creation and the invention of universal human dignity. We recall once again that every human is made in the divine image. The story continues, we begin again," unquote. And so tonight, as a community of diverse beliefs, we affirm our shared humanity, our respect for one another, and our vow not to be paralyzed by hopelessness or silenced by fear. Quote, "The story continues, we begin again."
Evening of November 8th, at night, we smelled fire, we heard explosions, but we lived near a synagogue, but we didn't dare go out to see what's going on. The next morning, I went to school. I had a 45-minute walk to school because we were forbidden to use public transportation. On the way, I passed a Jewish neighborhood, a Jewish street, a street where mostly jewelry stores were that were owned by Jews. The glass was all over the streets. The SA and the brown-shirt men were standing, yelling, screaming, "Don't buy from Jews. We want to get rid of the Jews." I walked to school. Of course, we were dismissed, and I had to walk back through the same tragedy home.
Kristallnacht 1938. It is a moment of unforgettable pictures and experience. Imagine going to school in the morning on a sunny day in Berlin, on the bicycle, expecting nothing evil. An hour into the class, the director of the school herself, Dr. Leonora Goldschmidt, came running around and said, "Go home, get to your bicycle, hurry up. We are surrounded by Hitler Youth and by SS and SA. They are throwing stones. Don't make eye contact." Yes, I made it home. But there is something that you cannot avoid, and that's a touch of culture shock and fear, because my family had lived a totally integrated life in Germany until the little town of East Prussia, with Hitler coming into their government, suddenly found us, 5 boys in the whole school, isolated because we were Jews, we were outsiders, we should be beaten up, and the teachers could not defend us because they would lose their job. My father moved us to Berlin. There was a Jewish directorship in this particular school, and we had a smooth sailing for about a year. My father's career as a lawyer was finished. He was not allowed to go to court any longer. And naturally, there was the possibility of finding a way to get out of Germany. But my father was an eternal optimist. Hitler is a madman. What can they do? The German people will realize that this cannot last. And now, my flashback to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. I ran back from school. The director told us to do that. I got home. My parents were very worried. And I really had a sort of culture shock because our life was integrated. And now all of a sudden, we were outsiders again. And I was 12. I was almost 13 years old. Put away the calculators. I was being prepared for bar mitzvah, to become an adult. However, it was very difficult because coming home, my mother walked me to the window, and what I saw was smoke. And the smoke was from the Fasanstrasse synagogue, 2 blocks away, where the bar mitzvah was going to take place. But the pictures of Jude scrabbled on the glass and smashed, the looting, the mob, the screaming, was something that I shall never forget. It's a picture engraved in one's mind.
Kristallnacht found me in Dienstlaken, Germany, in a kinderheim that was actually conducted by Dr. Rothschild, one of the Rothschild family. We had an ordinary day that day. It was the 9th of November, and somehow we had just dinner and things were going along fine, and suddenly all the lights went out. We were just terribly shocked because it became totally dark, and my best friend and I, Kate, grabbed each other by the hand and we tried to run to the beginning of the dining room. I didn't hear any, our counselors were shouting directions that neither of us were hearing, and as we were trying to get into the front of the dining room, we encountered an invasion, it seemed, of strangers, big men with heavy black boots and stomping all around us. Like one person, we flew into the pantry and kind of found refuge amongst all the amongst paper goods and brooms and whatever happens to be in the pantry. There was an enormous amount of crystal being broken down. We heard glass chattering and thundering sounds, and suddenly we watched in horror as all our furnishings in the dining room were thrown through what used to be just a few minutes ago doors and windows. We saw that even from the upstairs, all our belongings and the beddings were being thrown in the backyard into our playground, where usually there were swings and fun equipment for us to use. The next day, it was the 10th of November. We were able to get back to the kinderheims, the backyard where all the items were thrown, and there was just chaos all over. And I was viewing what was going on around me with all the rubble that was on the floor. And lo and behold, a miracle happened. I saw my photo album sticking out from amongst all the rubble that had been thrown there the night before. Picked everything up, and my pictures were just here and there and everywhere, and I was able to find all of them and put them together. And I must say that those pictures represented for me my identity, my very being, because that's all that was really proving that I existed. And it was going to be my identity for many years.
I wanted absolutely to see my synagogue. My parents, may they rest in peace, never agreed to this. The day goes by, another day. It is November the 12th. And I did, like some other kids do today, not listen to my parents. And I swindled myself out, and I went to the synagogue. I mean, it was a catastrophe. And people were around there and were speaking to each other. This was my goodness. So I said to the people, isn't it a shame what they did to this synagogue? But it didn't take long. I was taken from both sides. Two men in civil take me away. Where did they take me? To Dachau.
As with our previous two events this fall, tonight's presentation focuses on the theme, New Research, Perspectives, and Insights in Holocaust Studies. Dr. Paul Jaskot's scholarship and teaching exemplify innovative, cutting-edge, interdisciplinary research. We are fortunate to have him as our speaker this evening. Dr. Jaskot chairs the Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University, where he is also the co-director of the Digital Art History and Visual Culture Research Lab. Dr. Jaskot has written extensively on the political history of Nazi art and architecture, as well as on its post-war cultural impact. He is the author of The Architecture of Oppression, the SS Forced Labor, and the Nazi Monumental Building Economy, and a second book, The Nazi Perpetrator, Post-War German Art and the Politics of the Right. He is a founding member of the ongoing Holocaust Geography Collaborative, exploring the use of GIS and other digital methods to analyze the spatial history of the Holocaust. Truly important work. He is a contributor to the 2014 volume Geographies of the Holocaust, the first book to analyze Holocaust spaces with GIS. He is continuing that collaborative research through an NEH-funded project analyzing the spaces of the Nazi ghettos of occupied Europe. From 2014 to 2016, Dr. Jaskot was the Andrew Mellon Professor at the Center of Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. During 2008 to 2010, he served as the president of the College Art Association, which is the largest visual arts organization in the United States with some 14,000 members. Dr. Jaskot is currently president of the National Committee for the History of Art. We are honored that Dr. Jaskot will be speaking this evening on the topic, Architecture and Antisemitism Before and After the November 9th, 1938 pogrom, the political uses of building in Germany. Dr. Jaskot.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. I'm also very grateful to Jessica Malimick and the Rogers Center for having me, and of course for all of you for welcoming into your community. It's a very meaningful event. I've really already been feeling the importance of this. I must say this talk was written a bit before contemporary events, but I hope it still finds you with something to think about. There we go. I'm sure it seems clear to all of us that culture and genocide are contradictory terms. Culture is that which is best in human society, that which expresses our dreams and possibilities, as well as the uniqueness of our individual and shared group identities. Such expressions can happen in modest ways or in lofty aesthetic terms, such as in Chagall's devastatingly critical White Crucifixion, now hanging in the Art Institute of Chicago. This painting is the opposite of genocide, having nothing to do with the brutal, murderous environment of Auschwitz, for example. That death camp, which you see on the right, famously labeled a factory of death, embodies that which is worst in human society, our capacity to hate, to destroy, to attack the very diversity of peoples that make us human, if I may paraphrase Hannah Arendt. And yet we all know all too well that brutal, even genocidal perpetrators and regimes are invested in and may use culture to legitimate their actions and policies. Why is that? What makes culture productive for genocide? It is to this relationship between culture and genocide, between ideology and politics, that I wish to turn in my remarks tonight. Understanding the cultural dimensions of anti-Semitism and Nazi ambition helps us to clarify the complexity of the Holocaust and also evidences how it relied on the cooperation of all areas of German society, including the arts. focusing on cultural policy leading up to and resulting from the crucial moment of 1938, the moment of Kristallnacht, Pogrom, exemplifies exactly this dynamic between that which is held most dear in human society, our art, and that which is most grotesque, genocide. There we go. In 1938, the political actions of the Nazi regime, as we know, took a noticeable and brutal step forward. The anti-Semitic attacks of the 9 November pogrom radicalized racist policies, even as the drive to militarize the economy in preparation for war became all the more clear in that moment. In addition, the first imperialist expansions with the annexation of Austria and then the Sudetenland signaled that Hitler was seeing great progress made on his ideological, military, and authoritarian ambitions. The political significance of 1938 and the threat to German Jewry that year could not be clearer. In the art historical literature, however, we are generally inclined to emphasize the previous year of 1937 as much more central to the cultural history of the regime and anti-Jewish propaganda. After all, 1937 witnessed the infamous degenerate art show that vilified Jews and communists, as well as the first great German art exhibition in Munich, which promoted a racist Nazi ideal of supposedly ideal Aryan culture. These exhibitions overlapped with the cultural extravaganza of Albert Speer's pavilion at the Paris World's Fair that took these messages and German anti-Semitism to an international audience. In architectural terms, Paul Ludwig Trost's House of German Art became a showpiece of Hitler's interest and tastes, for example, while being received as a positive response to the insidious spread of supposedly Jewish international modernism. Given these and other events, the most careful art historical assessments of National Socialist Germany have invariably emphasized the significance of 1937. If 1938 belonged to state and party politics, 1937 represented the peak of Nazi cultural ideological goals, including anti-Semitic ones. While few scholars would argue that such a chronological division is so neat, nevertheless, the emphasis on such a distinction between 1937 and 1938, culture and politics, is a foundational assumption. Indeed, the Nazi hierarchy's cultural and ideological preferences, as well as the further consolidation of art policy within state institutions, were certainly well demonstrated in 1937. But if we shift our focus from internal interests within the art world to the external political developments of the state, 1938 also comes into focus as a crucial cultural year, particularly in the coordination of Nazi military and anti-Semitic politics with architectural goals. In this year, the consolidation of authority over monumental state and party architecture was aligned with the centralization of political economic power of the Nazi elite. In addition, the coordination of architectural priorities, especially involving the construction process, within key government agendas, made the importance of architecture not merely ideological, but also practical. In this sense, buildings not only expressed concepts of racialized community or history, but functioned in addition as a means of enacting and promoting policies of central importance to the state, including anti-Semitic policies. This functional political role of architecture became particularly visible and concrete as a systemic component of the Nazi administration in 1938. Thus, a focus on 1938 shows that architecture not only represented the propaganda goals of race and community, for example, embodied in Trost's building, but it also served to implement state and party policies seemingly unconnected with any aesthetic or cultural agenda. The move in 1938 from ideology to politics in the function of architecture is what I would like to focus on tonight. It can be traced by looking at three buildings in particular. Actually, I think I need one. Go back here. Come on, you could do it. Oh, there we go. That's the one I want. Thank you. It can be traced by looking at three buildings in particular, and I'll take them in roughly chronological order. Speer's German Stadium, Wilhelm Kreise's Soldiers Hall, and Speer's new Reichschancellery. Speer Stadium in Nuremberg exemplifies the shifting scale of ideological ambition, particularly evident in architecture by late 1937 and early 1938. The planning of Kreis's Berlin Memorial to the German military in 1938 not only expressed the state's interest in preparing for war, but also established the conditions for influencing the extension of key Nazi political goals, as we shall see. These included, above all, efforts to expand anti-Semitic policy, as well as develop the SS concentration camps as a weapon of control. And finally, the new chancellery, built in Berlin between January of 1938 and January of 1939, embodied the integration of culture, along with all aspects of German society, into the militarist and imperialist goals of world domination, which would open the door to the Holocaust. Around and through these buildings, 1938 represented a significant year of consolidation of authority, architectural and otherwise, as well as coordination of political economic priorities for the coming war. The Jewish victims of the 9 November pogrom that we commemorate today were part of a network of racist and military ambitions in 1938 that included significant cultural interests. The shift in an architectural focus from Nuremberg and Munich to Berlin, the overt consolidation of power under Speer, and the integration of architectural goals with anti-Semitic politics made this year a key to understanding the instrumentalization of culture in National Socialist Germany. Only through analyzing this complex cultural history can we explain the political and ideological complexity of the Holocaust itself. We begin with the propagandistic value of architecture. The German stadium. Like the other buildings at the Nuremberg Party rally grounds, the stadium incorporated forms that referenced both ancient Greek and Roman sources. Overtly Roman with its massive arcade, barrel-vaulted construction, and horseshoe plan like a Roman circus, it also contained Greek touches, such as the propylaea entrance, that little gate-like entrance at the forecourt there, as well as the colonnade and the Doric order. Architects used such tactics in most premier buildings in the regime, as is well known. These choices corresponded to either critics who imagined architecture in Nazi Germany as the modern racial extension of the so-called Aryan culture of Greece, or those party insiders who emphasized the state's claims of imperial greatness, essentially as a new Rome. While many different architectural styles, from modernist to medieval, were used by official patrons in the Nazi era, major party and state buildings almost exclusively employed these stripped-down neoclassical forms. But in spite of this ideological aesthetic consistency with previous buildings, the German stadium also represents something different in terms of scale and ambition that marks it as an introduction to the integration of architecture with other political goals in this period, that is, as our turning point from 37 to 38. The massive new scale of architectural projects became noticeable and noticeably clear with the groundbreaking of the German stadium at the party rally late in that year. A scale further confirmed in the public release of information on the plans to redesign Berlin in January of 1938. Whereas specific earlier structures, like Ludwig Ruf's Congress Hall from 1934, were certainly massive, the hall's capacity to seat about 50,000 people was not so far from other large contemporary venues in and outside of Germany. The German stadium was different by multiple degrees. Speer's building would be big enough for 400,000 people or more, making it by far the largest stadium in the world. Just as a point of comparison, Soldiers Field in Chicago is 80,000 people. It would require at least 350,000 cubic meters of granite for its exterior. Notably, the entire German granite industry at the time produced no more than 80,000 cubic meters in total. So this one building would require 4 times what that one year's worth of granite could produce. The stadium was so large that Speer was forced to build a mock-up of the seats in a valley near Nuremberg in order to confirm sight lines and visibility for those furthest from the field. The significant and dramatic increase in ambition, evident in the scale, expressed also the political expansionist goals of the state. Hitler, in 1937 and increasingly in 1938, made clear his interest in war as a means of extending German territory to the east. The German stadium, unlike the other buildings at the party rally grounds, was not planned to consolidate constituencies in the present, but rather to plan for a post-war Germanic future in which the world would look to the Nazi state as the new center. In this case, Szneer planned here for all post-war Olympics, for example, and major world sporting events that would now be centralized in one massive world-sized stadium. Scale mattered in a different way in this moment. This expanded ideological goal intersected with the political interests of foreign policy that became increasingly aggressive and overt in 1938, including the Anschluss of Austria and the Munich Agreement in September that gave Germany the Sudetenland. In cultural terms, one might also consider the opening that year of Ernst Heiger's German Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, a further representation of the connection between cultural ideology and foreign policy. With Germania carved into its entablature, it harkened back to the Roman characterization of land east of the Rhine that had resisted imperial control. Such imperialist allusions further complemented the stripped-down classicism of the external form. This architecture served the coordination of ideology with newly expressed political positions. There. Still, even as buildings signaled an expansionist, military, and imperialist Nazi ambition, the example of the German stadium remains in the realm of propaganda and ideology. In much more brutal practical terms, however, architecture was also a tool for influencing and extending state and party goals, apparently well beyond culture. Kreis's Soldiers' Hall and Speer's redesign of Berlin make this moment clear. While Hitler had given Szneer control over the rebuilding of Berlin already in 1936, the nature and extent of the plans only became publicly clear on January 28, 1938, in a formal announcement by Speer's office of the Inspector General of Building for the Reichscapital Berlin, or GBI. The remodeling of the capital on the scale of Haussmann's Paris or the Rome of the Caesars signaled clearly the move from the individuals or relatively isolated projects of Munich, Nuremberg, and elsewhere to the emphasis on a systemic and large-scale architectural plan for the political center. It also made clear Speer's unilateral authority outside of normal channels of government oversight, as the GBI did not report to state administrators or even city officials. It stood directly under the approval of Hitler. As Hitler was to politics, so too would Szneer be to architecture. Speer's role was further made clear, as in spite of his young age, he was 33 in 1938, he was able to gather established architects of a previous generation, like Peter Behrens or Kreis, to take part in the major operations of designing and constructing hundreds of new buildings. Like the German stadium, Kreis's Soldiers' Hall combined a Roman imperial scale, sculptural details, and a barrel-vaulted interior with Greek forms, in this case deriving from the famous Pergamon altar. Kreis designed the building, its relation to the site, and its material specifications by 1938, when a model was prominently illustrated in Gerty Trost's publication, Building in the New Reich, although details of the design were not finalized until early 1939. But while its formal resonance might be consistent with other buildings in the Nazi state, its connection to a functional politics was not, and that's what interests us here tonight. That is to say, the building went well beyond ideology, especially in terms of its requirements for particular high-quality granite, as well as its relationship to its site. This building indicates clearly the very new architectural and political conditions of 1938 Germany. Kreis's project required a massive amount of white-flecked granite, 96,000 cubic meters for the facade alone, to be specific. The quality and appearance, Hitler chose himself. Gathering such an amount was not only a problem for the architect and the GBI, but also formed a possibility for any quarry firm that could accommodate the large-scale and prioritized need of one of Hitler's major projects. Fatefully, the SS and the economic firm under its control were one such institution that saw a future for itself in the quarry business. After 1936, when Heinrich Himmler had his authority as leader of the SS combined with his new position as head of the German police, He and his administrative chief, Oswald Pohl, began to reorganize the concentration camp system, particularly around the idea of making it economically productive through the use of forced labor. Such interest crystallized in the form of what was called the German Earth and Stone Works in April of 1938, a firm set up particularly to maximize the production of bricks in the camp of Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, as well as to develop the granite quarry facilities at the newly established camps of Kehl-Flossenburg and Kehl-Mauthausen. Not only was such a plan developed through Himmler's interaction with Speer and Hitler, but Speer's rebuilding of Berlin became a crucial justification for the brutal expansion of SS forced labor operations into the monumental building economy. The first GBI contract for bricks was signed in July of 1938. As this business deal makes clear, architecture and politics were complementary spheres, not contradictory or competing. The quarry concerns at Flossenburg and Mauthausen were especially coordinated with architectural priorities, as they were set up in 1938 around exactly the kind of high-quality deposits best suited to monumental building. While it took time for the SS to develop the sites, by 1940, Flossenburg in particular had been set up to deliver stone to Berlin. Indeed, the most consistent and largest orders for the SS facility there came for Kreis's Soldiers' Hall. Thus, in 1938, the conjunction of Hitler's interest in architecture with the opportunism of Himmler's expanded SS operations linked decisively the extension of the punitive political power of the state to its most overt cultural agenda. This was a very different relationship to politics that went well beyond the ideological expression of previous years. It would also have devastating long-term effects, especially for the increased number of politically active Jews, occupational criminals, communists, and homosexuals that the SS began arresting in much larger numbers in 1938. By 1943, when the forced labor operations at Flossenburg were finally shut down and Pohl had redirected the inmates to production for the military effort, over 30,000 prisoners had lost their lives, most in the quarries cutting the stone for Kreis's project. The decisions made in 1938 for the Soldiers' Hall specifically, and the GBI plan for Berlin, had more generally also other political effects. In particular, architectural plans came to interact directly with the developing anti-Semitic policy of the state for the first time in this year. From the late Weimar Republic rants of Paul Schultz and Naumburg against Jewish and Bolshevik art and architecture, through to the promotion of the supposed purity of Trost buildings in Munich, architecture had been part of the racist propaganda of the Nazi Party, displayed in the pages of the Völkische Beobachter, the party newspaper, for example. There is no evidence, though, that Speer was particularly interested in this ideological debate. Instead, he took a pragmatic approach to architecture that involved him in racist politics in a decidedly new way, only in that year. That's what we want. Great. Specifically, 1938 marked the moment when Speer developed within the GBI its own anti-Semitic policy around the issue of Jewish housing in Berlin. I want to emphasize that. The architects came up with the anti-Semitic policy. The vast scale of the Berlin plans required the destruction of hundreds of structures, small and large. Those building owners would have to be compensated. And it was Speer and his staff who developed the idea of using new policies directed to Jewish housing rights as a response to this difficulty. By August of 1938, the GBI already could require the city of Berlin to purchase properties needed for their extensive plans. This was followed, though, in September by meetings between the GBI and government officials to propose moving against Jewish renter rights as a way of helping the construction plans go forward. From Speer's perspective, displacing Jews could be an effective tool for providing substitute property for those non-Jewish Germans forced to leave their homes because of the Berlin plans. It is worth remembering that by this date, no systematic move had been made by the Nazi state against the rights of Jewish tenants or property owners. Thus, Speer's suggestion was an expansion of current anti-Semitic policy that went even beyond the plans of the SS at this stage. Indeed, in one meeting, he even proposed gathering Jewish household, quote-unquote, in closed blocks little short of a ghetto, well before the idea became state policy in the East after the outbreak of World War II. But the violent 9 November pogrom against Jewish communities, businesses, and individuals moved any discussion of Jewish property rights out of the individual ministries like Speer's into a position as a central government concern. Göring, for example, chaired a meeting with Goebbels and Heydrich, representing the SS, on November 12th, following the pogrom, to plan the next steps against the Jewish community. In addition to a number of topics addressed, Jewish housing was discussed, including the possibility for ghettoization. Heydrich rejected this proposal, that is, the SS rejected this proposal, however, on the grounds that it would supposedly isolate the Jewish community and possibly allow them to organize resistance. He thought it was better if Jews remained concentrated in houses in mixed neighborhoods as a means of using one part of the German population to watch the other. Hitler finalized this decision in a law from April 30th of 1939 that restricted Jewish renter rights but did not concentrate them in specific Jewish areas, that is, stopped short of ghettoization. In this regard, anti-Semitic policy seemed to take a brutal direction distinct from cultural goals. But such was not the case. Speer's ideas were not completely forgotten. In a separate decree of November 26, 1938, Göring required that all Jewish property Aryanized in Berlin be registered not with the SS, as it was in all other German cities, but rather with the architects of the GBI. This important political alliance with architecture set the stage for fulfilling both the goals of Speer's plans for Berlin, as well as the future concentration and then deportation of the Berlin Jews. One result of this fateful decision would be, for example, that the Architectural Office organized the deportation of the Berlin Jews to ghettoization and murder in the East during the war. Such an overt demonstration of the political function of architecture formed the foundation for the coordination of building with state goals. Speer's new Reichschancellery represented one final bravura display of this moment of transition. Announced to great fanfare in January of 1938, the construction of this large facility for Hitler proceeded at a rapid pace. It was completed in only 1 year. The Reichschancellery certainly represented the expanded scale of the goals we saw evident with the German stadium. In particular, since the Greek sources are much less in evidence here, the dominant theme is Roman and imperial, with the large mosaic-covered walls which you see here, massive construction, and absolute emphasis on the single power of Hitler as a modern Caesar. Other kinds of leadership models complemented the Roman forms, such as Speer's use of the double recessed columns which you see on the right in the forecourt that conjured up the Medici patronage of Michelangelo's Laurentian library, and more overtly, the long marble hall outside of Hitler's office, obviously attempting to outdo the absolutism of Louis XIV's Versailles. The shift in scale and emphasis on imperialism and unilateral authority marked a more direct integration of ideological goals with the political interests of the moment. In 1938, Hitler consolidated his influence on European politics, especially through the Munich Agreement, but he was also planning for the expansionist goals of war. Militarism and the centralization of authority under the leader, both for internal cohesion of the state, but also as an external sign to European powers, were political positions that aligned with the specific forms and functions of the Reichschancellery. Given this moment of diplomacy, political positioning, and military preparation, it is not surprising that Hitler used the new building to emphasize his imperial authority and stage his interactions with the diplomatic corps in Berlin. Notably, once the war broke out, he became relatively uninterested in this building. That is to say, diplomacy was no longer needed. That was not the political goal. At any rate, he knew it would be replaced by his long-term plans for Berlin after a presumably successful German campaign, and in that sense, the building served only the immediate ideological and political necessity of the moment. Cynically, that meant manipulating the appearance of diplomacy to assert absolute imperialist ambitions for German expansion, goals that would seal the fate of millions of European Jews. Planning, design, and construction activities for the German Stadium, the Soldiers' Hall, and the new Reichschancellery thus marked the importance of 1938 as a crucial year in the relation of architecture to politics in Nazi Germany. This analysis does not deny the significance of the previous year of 37 for the history of Nazi art and architecture. It does, though, show how the integration of cultural goals with state policies could parallel other non-cultural interests, including the radicalization of racist and militarist policies of Nazi leadership. Thus, attending to the specificity of dates, buildings, and policies in the developing history of the Nazi state helps us to clarify the function of culture beyond its ideological role, above all, the integration of anti-Semitic goals with architecture. But indeed, by the end of 1938, Goering could not have made the political integration of culture much clearer. He specifically consolidated, for example, the authority of building and coordination of state preparations for war with other seemingly non-related architectural interests, for example, in his preparation of a new office called the General Plenipotentiary for the regulation of the building economy. This was, though, not only a building that was relevant for the military economy, but it also included Hitler's special projects, that is, the buildings in Berlin, Nuremberg, and Munich. That is to say, by 1938, military and cultural goals were actually one and the same. They're in the same major office. There we go. Yes. In this regard, the implications of the nexus of architecture, anti-Semitic policy, and military ambitions extended well beyond 1938. Indeed, with the outbreak of war on September 1st of 1939, the expansion could be tied to state goals that also relied for their achievement on the capacity to build. This led to the deadly link between cultural interests, political goals, and genocide. As Adam Tooze and others have noted, taking the economic resources of Central and Eastern Europe by force was necessary from Hitler's perspective to sustain Germany's industry and population until the presumed defeat of the British, after which the Eastern settlement agenda could begin in earnest. Construction was a variable used tool for supporting the military drive and policies of oppression. In other words, through construction activity, architectural plans and the murder of European Jews could both be achieved. For example, building IG Farben's synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz, or Monowitz, or Auschwitz III as it's called, cost the lives of 30,000 forced laborers, fulfilling military and genocidal goals, as is well known. In addition, the construction of highways for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was equally deadly. And from the Nazi perspective, the planned construction labor required for the resettlement in the post-war East would be at least 400 to 800,000 workers who, upon completion of their task, could be removed through immigration or merely through genocide. As this short list implies, construction and the making of Nazi place out of ethnically diverse space was central to the agenda of Hitler's regime. Thinking about the building economy less from the actual work of labor makes these connections between architecture, anti-Semitic politics, and economics clear. It highlights how such a triad of interests increased the capacity of the Nazi state for war and genocide. For example, the German occupation of Krakow involved substantial interest in manipulation of the built environment. The construction site of the Vistula, which flows through Krakow, here visible in a digital model we've created of Ritter's 1941 Nazi plan of the city, highlights the intersection of interests. The straightening of the Vistula on the left of the image, highlighted in blue, is a seemingly neutral background decision. Straightening the river, however, involved blending construction activity with economic, ideological, and genocidal interests. With economic considerations, for example, by May of 1940, the General Governor Hans Frank had made the regularization of the Vistula from Warsaw through Krakow a priority of standardizing transportation in order to expand the river's economic productivity, especially for the war effort. In addition to local Polish firms, German and Danish construction firms in particular were brought in to implement this work. In ideological terms, however, changing the river's edge was also needed in order to Germanize Krakow by providing the necessary space for the geometrically regular Nazi administrative district called for in Ritter's plan, which you see on the right. Such a plan needed building to give the city a clear Nazi imprint that would, as with Speer's Berlin, include ridding the city of its Jewish population. Cultural Germanification needed anti-Semitic spatial policies. And for the Polish Jews, This was not just Nazi economics and ideology, but also the new reality of the massive role construction forced labor would take on in their lives. For example, already by the end of 1940, the water administration in charge of work on the Vistula had 400 construction sites, employing over 41,000 workers and abusing 16,145 Jewish forced laborers daily. The shift in the river can thus also be a reminder of their experience, otherwise invisible in most histories. I'm coming to my conclusion here. Oh, sorry, those maps are hard to read. In this brief discussion of construction during the war, I've tried to emphasize that the integration of political priorities and buildings that we saw in 1938 expanded into a more sinister and deadly set of practices and policies during the war. In addition, an emphasis on expansion is exactly the element that links the abuse of Jewish forced labor to the Nazi ability to build the capacity for further military expansion and economic exploitation. Scale matters, to put it bluntly. This allows us, for example, to see together the German-wide scale of this partial draft map on the left of a few sites of activity for major construction firms and forced labor, and it's drawn from just a small sample of labor cards from the International Tracing Service archive that we've started to mine. As well as, I might say, this very surprising map on the right, which shows that the largest single category of forced labor activity for European Jews in the ghetto system was construction. Extending our analysis from 1938 to think about the business of building during the war moves our attention away from individual building sites or even case study urban locations. Instead, it focuses our analysis on the systemic conditions of war and genocide that were integrated with and expanded by the construction industry. The broader role of building at the level of all construction is clearly much more central to the intersection of war drive with the oppression of the Jews than has previously been suggested by scholars. Conversely, the role of civilians or conscripted building and construction personnel in perpetuating the horrors of the Holocaust is clearly under-investigated. We are only just now beginning to see, literally, the built environment and construction as a central aspect of planning and enacting the Holocaust, as well as its broader political and ideological significance to perpetrators and victims. The spatial politics suggested in the history of building priorities in 1938 needs to be extended to account for a more complex and integrated history of culture and the Holocaust, including the German occupation and the role of architecture. In this process, we also need to account for the forced construction labor of tens of thousands of Jews written out of that architectural history. My highlighting of the function of building to link military and genocidal goals is not merely a scholarly one, though. It was also something acknowledged and instrumentalized in the German occupation itself. One final example. As the commander of Sonderkommando 4A of the Einsatzgruppe C, Paul Blobel led the September 1941 massacre of over 33,000 Jews in Babi Yar. He distinguished himself not only in anti-Semitic atrocities, but in such grotesque roles as being the organizer of the Action 1005 of 1942, which was the attempt to dig up all mass graves in the occupied East, burn the bodies, and dispose of the Jewish ashes. And yet, there's something more to Blobel's grotesque biography. He was also a trained and practicing architect. Indeed, Blobel was chosen for Action 105 because he was an architect. His skills at managing the digging of foundations, as well as the ability to blend new construction into existing sites, that is, to cover over the evidence, were eminently suitable to the job of digging up tens of thousands of Jewish victims and erasing the crime scene. He had developed through his construction industry experience exactly the capacity for the element of genocide that the SS needed. Without this capacity, and that more broadly of the construction industry, Nazi cultural ideals, military ambitions, and genocidal acts simply could not be built. That is the lesson of architecture and anti-Semitism in 1938. Thank you.
My name is Rania Chesti, and I'm this year's president of the Interfaith Council. Today, I'll be representing the Muslim Student Association by doing a reading from Besa, Muslims Who Saved Jews in World War II by Norman Gershom. Yad Vashem, the Jerusalem-based Holocaust memorial, honors more than 22,000 non-Jewish rescuers as righteous among the nations. Of these, most are Christians. Also included, however, is a contingent of Muslim rescuers from Albania and nearby regions. As elsewhere during World War II, Jews in Albania were especially targeted for destruction by the Germans, but their fate there was altered by an ancient and sacrosanct Albanian principle known as Besa, one's word of honor. In Albania, when a person gives you his Besa to act in a certain way, then he is committed to abide by it, whatever the circumstances. This was coupled with another inherently Albanian folk principle, that of giving refuge to someone in need of help. As a result, nearly all of the 2,000 Jews in Albania were spared the furnaces of Auschwitz, for they were hidden or otherwise sheltered by the mostly Muslim population. Survivors related that Albanians vied with each other for the honor of sheltering the fleeing Jews. This Islamic behavior of compassion and mercy celebrates the sanctity of life and a view of the other, the stranger, as indeed one's own close family member. Ironically, their story remained unknown for many years. The tale of the rescue of Albania's Jews has only recently come to the fore.
I'm Callie Yates, and I am here representing disciples on campus. I'll begin with a reading by Martin Niemöller. Martin Niemöller was a German pastor, theologian, and the leader of a group of German clergy opposed to the Nazis. Hear this famous poem by Niemöller. First, they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. More recently, Pope Francis has spoken out on more than one occasion commemorating Kristallnacht in his words, quote, "We renew our closeness and solidarity to the Jewish people, our big brothers, and pray to God that the memory of the past and of the sins of the past helps us to be always vigilant against every form of hate and intolerance."
Blessing for the longest night. All throughout these months, as the shadows have lengthened, this blessing has been gathering itself, making ready, preparing for this night. It is practiced walking in the dark, traveling with its eyes closed, feeling its way by memory, by touch, by the pull of the moon, even as it wanes. So believe me when I tell you this blessing will reach you, even if you have not light enough to read it. It will find you, even though you cannot see it coming. You will know the moment of its arriving by your release of the breath you have held so long, a thinning of the darkness that has drawn itself around you. This blessing does not mean to take the night away, but it knows its hidden roads, knows the resting spots along the path, knows what it means to travel in the company of a friend. So when this blessing comes, take its hand, get up, set out on the road you cannot see. This is the night when you can trust that any direction you go, you will be walking toward the dawn.
Mole rachamim, shochem b'meromim, hametzei menuchot nechono, tachas kanefei hashchino. B'malos kedoshim, kedoshim utorim, kezohar horokiya ma'asirim, esni shemos, achenu v'yachyoseinu, achenu v'yachyoseinu, shenehergo ושנשכחו אותו ושנשרוף ביד הרוצחים הגרמנים קידוש השם בגני עדן תהיה מנוחוסום לוחן בלו רחמים יסתירם בסייסר כנופוף ליעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים אסן ישמעותיהם אדוני ונחלו ובוסום וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם ונאמר אמן.